So this is the fourth time I participate in this great event, and I still don't speak Spanish. I know it's a shame, but I'm sorry about that. Anyway, as Miguel was saying in introduction, this country's conference is really a landmark event for us at Coface. Every year we organize around 25 conferences all around the world, in all key regions, a lot in Latin America, one in the US, a lot, of course, in Europe, both in Western Europe and Eastern Europe. We have some in Asia as well. And even this year, we could do one later this year in Western Africa for the first time. And it's a fact of timing, but in some cases, this type of event, of course, coincides with major political events. For example, 2 years ago, we did one in London just a few days before the vote, and at that time in the room we could feel a lot of people that were angry against the EU, and we could feel the no would win. Then a few months later, we were in Hong Kong, just a few hours after the vote in the US. And a lot of people in Hong Kong in the room were already worried about what we're going to talk today, protectionism. And no later than last week, I was in Milan, the day of the nomination of the new prime minister in Italy. So having said this, something big could happen in Spain today. I don't know exactly what, but I know something will happen. So anyway, it's a joke, but it's just to keep in mind that this type of event is organized to talk about that, to talk about the impact of major political and economic events on businesses. So sometimes it's easy to do that. In some days it's not easy. I guess today it's not an easy one because a lot of things are happening. But this is the reason why we do this type of event. So let's move on. Before talking about hot topics, hot political topics, let's start with the good news. And here you see our global scenario. So Alex was showing you her GDP growth forecast. This is quite the same picture, but as a credit insurer, we like looking at business insolvencies instead of GDP growth forecast. And the picture is quite crystal clear. I mean, you see here 20 major economies in the world, and last year business insolvencies decreased quite significantly in most of them. And of course, on the left part of the chart, you see Portugal, Netherlands, which did really well last year because they're, let's say, smaller open economies, so they benefited a lot from the pickup in global trade. And then more in the middle, you see a lot of let's say, large major economies with domestic demand-driven economies. And they did quite well, including Spain, of course. And on the right part of the slide, you see a few exceptions, including the UK. You're not going to be surprised, and a few Nordics countries because of problems in the housing sector in these areas. So what to expect for this year? Again, this is a blue line, and figures in blue, quite the same thing. We're still quite optimistic. And that's the key message of my presentation, despite all this political noise. I mean, the overall macroeconomic and even microeconomic situation remains pretty good. Having said this, you also realize by looking at this chart that the movement is a little bit drying up. I mean, in most countries, business insolvencies have already recovered to their pre-crisis low, meaning that there is not much room for catch-up anymore. And so in other words, even if we remain quite optimistic regarding business insolvencies and economic activity for businesses this year, we have also to recognize that the peak has been passed last year. And this is perhaps one of the key changes since the starting of the year. Another way to look at it is business confidence. You see, again, the picture is quite crystal clear. Whether you look at it on the US on the left or in the Eurozone on the right. I could have added Asian countries. It would have been exactly the same. So level of confidence is still quite high in those areas, but it's not as high as it used to be. So at first glance, it's quite surprising, because I've just told you that business insolvencies are lower than they used to be almost everywhere. And despite this, we see businesses are not as confident as they used to be last year. So the question is why? I think there are two key factors. The first one is something we don't talk much about, is that we see in business surveys that more and more businesses are saying they are more and more worried and concerned about labor shortages. So this is not really surprising in some countries like the US, Japan, Germany, where unemployment is very low, close to, let's say, 25 to even 30-year low. In some other countries, to tell you the truth, it's really surprising. It surprised most economists, most people, because it also happens, and we see it even in countries where, in some cases, unemployment is quite high. So in those types of countries, it's very, at first glance, it's more difficult to understand this trend. When we look at it more into detail, it's not so surprising. And one of the reasons why, in some cases, you have still labor shortages for businesses despite a still high unemployment, it's because in some countries, and here you see the example for France, but I could have showed some other countries, it would have been the same. In some cases, this is one of the legacy of the big crisis. I mean, because of the big crisis, it has been very, very strong, very long. A lot of people are still jobless, and they have been jobless for quite a long period of time, meaning that even if this is a recovery, businesses don't want to hire them because they don't match with their needs. That's as simple as it is. You see it in France. This is a number of people that have been jobless for more than 3 years, and over the past 20 years, it never exceeded 400,000 people, and since the crisis, it has surged to about 1 million. So it means two things. The first one, from a business standpoint, it means that more and more businesses are constrained in their investment decisions despite the recovery. That's the reason why we're still optimistic, but we don't expect, in most countries, growth to be as high this year as it used to be last year. And of course, the second one, you're well aware of it, is that a lot of people in a lot of countries are still frustrated. Because if you think about it, in crisis times, in recession times, if you lose your job, okay, you're jobless, but at least you see that your neighbor is jobless as well. Now we're in recovery times. We see some people finding jobs. We see unemployment is going lower, but you don't find any job. I think you're even more frustrated than you used to be 4 to 5 years ago. And this is exactly what we're seeing in a lot of countries. So the problem is, despite the recovery in the US, in Western Europe, we're still in the middle of this vicious cycle in terms of political risk. So if we start from the top, people that are unemployed are still very numerous. And so they feel frustrated, they feel this is unfair, they feel corruption is high. Sometimes it's real, sometimes it's perception only, but in both cases, it means they're frustrated. So they don't trust anymore institutions because they think they're said it's democratic institutions, but in fact they are not. And again, in some cases, this is real. In some other cases, this is only perception, but in both, it means they're frustrated. So if they think our institutions are weak, they mean they're looking for strong leaders, for new parties, new people coming in. And those new people, in most cases, they don't have good policies, so growth remains low, and so on. And this vicious cycle is very, very difficult to break. And we're seeing it at the moment, of course, in Italy. We're seeing it in a lot of other places. And that's a paradox. Despite the recovery, despite strong growth, we're still in the middle of this cycle in a lot of places. So looking at, for example, Italy, we know the transmission channels now between political risk on the one side and business activity on the other side. We know it very well. We have seen it over the past 10 years. Spreads on financial markets increase. Businesses tend to postpone their investment decisions, the same for households. Then the question is, what type of business is impacted first? In this type of situation, of course, businesses that are affected firstly are the ones that are over-indebted, whatever their economic sector, and the ones that will have to roll over their funding on financial markets in the short term. So in other words, it means they're businesses that are a little bit zombie. So zombie is a term that has been created in Japan in the 90s. And at that time, some people in Japan were saying, we have a lot of businesses that are over-indebted, that don't invest, that don't grow, but despite this, they're still alive because of very easy funding conditions. And at that time, there were said to be about 20 to 25% of companies in Japan that were in this situation. And so that's the reason why Japan's growth has remained so low over the past 20 years. So we have made our calculations to try to look at the situation in Europe and to try to know whether we're in the same type of situation or not. So if you look at figures for Germany, Spain, Italy, and France, if you look at glass half full, we are very far from levels in Japan in the 90s. If you look at 2016, even the highest level is in Spain, and it's only 6% of companies that would be in this type of situation. So we are very far from the situation in Japan at that time. But nevertheless, it's still quite a significant share of companies that are, let's say, vulnerable to an increase in interest rates on financial markets in the short term. So when I showed you a slide on business confidence, and I was telling you it's puzzling because it's decreasing despite the pretty good financial situation of corporates. I told you there are two rationales behind this. The first one is labor shortages in some places. The second one is definitely protectionism. So we're going to talk a lot about it this morning. So I will be fast on this. A very simple way to look at it is how the word protectionism is looked at in Google search. It's not surprising to see that it increased a lot right after the Lehman crisis. And then, of course, it decreased because the economic situation improved. And then it surged back from late 16 because of the US election, of course. Then the question is it only perception or is it reality? And the point is, if we look at protectionism measures at global level, so far we can't really say there have been a huge increase in protectionism at global level. This is data which comes from a US private non-profit organization which lists all around the world all protectionist measures that have been decided in all countries, in all sectors. So since 2014, you see the trend is clearly on the downside, meaning that there is less protectionism than it used to be during the crisis, which is not surprising. In recovery times, in better economic times, countries are less worried about that, and so they tend to protect less their businesses. So despite all this noise on protectionism at this stage, and of course, these figures don't include the measures that have been decided yesterday by the US and this morning by Canada. But at this stage, we can't say there is a strong increase in protectionism. Having said this, if we look at the breakdown between, on the one side, the US and the rest of the world, you see that the orange part coming from the US, it's increasing. But even on this side, the number of protectionist measures in the US is lower now than it used to be in 11 and 12 when Obama was at the White House. And again, that's a paradox. So I know we're talking a lot about it. Of course, it's going to affect a lot of businesses, but at global level, again, we don't have to be over pessimistic on this topic. So that's the reason why, in terms of global trade forecasts, we are not so pessimistic, and we continue to expect, according to our simple statistical models, that global trade will increase quite decently this year. This is the orange bar, and to say it differently, it's because, according to us, I mean, the usual drivers of global trade are still at play. Because if you think about it this way, why do a company which is based in a developing country, in a developing economy, export to a major market? In most cases, because of labor costs. And on this side, the situation has not changed much over the past 20 years. I mean, when China entered the WTO and started to export a lot 20 years ago, it was because of very low labor cost. So on this chart, you see GDP per capita, let's say a proxy for labor cost, in a lot of developing economies as a percentage of the level in the US. So let's look only at China. Okay, in 18 years ago, GDP per capita in China accounted for 6% of the US one. It has increased a lot, but it's still only no more than 25% of the US GDP per capita. So it's 4 times less. So in other words, if there is an increase in tariff of, let's say, 10% or 25%, okay, it can be a big impact for some businesses, but for most of them, it's not enough to avoid them to export. And now, if you want to look at it the other way, why do a company based in a major market wants to export to a developing one? In most cases, to penetrate a fast-rising market where there is a large and increasing middle class. And on this side as well, the situation is not going to change anytime soon. I mean, in 10 years, the middle class will be 1 billion people in India, 1 billion people in China. So even though there is an increase in tariffs on some products, it's not going to change the broad picture, the story for most companies. So what does that mean exactly for businesses? Of course, it means that globalization is not over. I know there have been a lot of newspapers articles on this topic in recent months because of what I've just showed you. On the other side, we can't say neither that we can forget borders. I mean, 10 years ago, there were a lot of analysts saying that multinationals can forget borders, they can go everywhere they want without looking at what's going on at country level. Because of thanks to globalization, it's not true anymore. So we have to, businesses will continue to export, but on the other hand, they will have to be more aware of country differences, country risk. So you know, at Coface, we used to do that. We provide country risk assessments for 160 countries. This is the current picture. So to do that, to get this map, we combine a lot of indicators to measure political risk, to measure risk at macroeconomic and financial levels. We take, of course, into account our payment experience, and we get this 8-grade scale from A1 to E. So when it's in green, it's good. When it's in red, it's, of course, more risky. So since we met last year, we decided 41 changes. 28 have been upgrades, and 13 have been downgrades. So it's a pretty good summary of my presentation. The situation has improved globally, but nevertheless, the situation has not improved everywhere, and you see still plenty of red, meaning that the level of risk is still high in a lot of countries, especially in the emerging world. So very fast, I would like to highlight some key risks as a business you have to be aware of if you want to export or invest in emerging markets. I will be fast. Of course, the first one is China. I will make it short because Alex already showed some figures on it. Of course, I know the situation looks quite good if you look at basic macroeconomic indicators in China. According to us, we're still pretty cautious if you look at the situation on a company-by-company level. And you can look on our website. We have released a few weeks ago a survey on, as we do every year, a survey on corporate payment conditions for China. And again, you see it on the right, more and more companies this year are complaining about very long payment delays, and especially in sectors like construction and energy. So all in all, at political level, we don't talk about it enough, but the rulers are more and more concerned about the let's say, tough economic situation. So they have tightened the control at political level. You've seen it in the news. Xi Jinping has been re-elected by the Communist Party for a second mandate. And of course, then he has also managed to change the constitution to be able to be re-elected after 2022. A lot of people are saying it's not a big change anyway. China was not a democracy before. It's still not a democracy. The problem is, to me, it can be a big change because from a political and from a social standpoint, China used to be ruled by a party, and now more and more China is going to be ruled by a man. So if you're a Chinese people, a young man or a young girl, and you want to participate in the action for your country, before you could at least, despite the lack of political freedom, you could at least say, okay, I can be part of the Communist Party and then act for my country. Now, if you assume that the Communist Party is less useful than it used to be, it's not the same anymore. So when China will face an economic crisis because of this huge problem regarding corporate debt, there are more and more chances now it also faces in the same time a political crisis because social frustration is likely to increase in the coming years. Risk number 2, very fast. Again, Alex has already talked about it. So this is going to be the English version. We've seen because, and perhaps this is because of one of the secondary effect, second round effect coming from Donald Trump's policy, we have seen a lot of, over the past 2 months, a lot of capital outflows out from emerging markets. So to make it short, over the past 2 years, we've been very worried about oil exporting countries in the emerging world because of lower commodity prices. Now that's one of the key news this year. The focus is switching more on countries with large current account deficit. In most cases, they're also oil and commodity importers because they rely on external financing, and you see them on the left part of the slide. They rely on external financing because they have a current account deficit, or because they have to roll over a lot of debt in the coming months and quarters, so they're very vulnerable when there are some capital outflows. And in this type of situation, in these countries, businesses suffering the most are the ones that import a lot of inputs because the price of inputs is going to increase, like the construction sector, or sectors where it depends a lot on private consumption because inflation is going to rise in those countries, like, for example, the retail sector. So it's not a shock for all companies. It's not a negative shock for all businesses, but we have really to look at the situation on a sector-by-sector basis. And last but not least, of course, and this will be my final word, we have been talking a lot about political risk in mature economies. But again, this is not new. I talked about it last year, but this is still a hot topic. We have also to keep in mind there are still plenty of political risks in the emerging world. Here, to make it fast, this is our own political risk index, which is based on all indicators you see in the bottom of the chart. We take into account socioeconomic indicators that makes it possible to measure social frustration, like growth, income inequalities, corruption, inflation, and so on. And then we say, okay, in some cases, the population is frustrated, but this social frustration is not reflected into effective political change because there is no tool to express this frustration. And by tools, we mean access to the internet, education level, urbanization. So all indicators that are in green in the bottom of the chart. So all in all, here it gives you here the top 30 countries in the world where social risk is the highest according to us. Forget the top 4 to 5 on the left part because they are countries in war. So anyway, political risk is of course very high in those countries. But the key message here is that you see on this chart number of large economies, large emerging market economies where, of course, despite the recent recovery in the emerging world, we still have to be cautious and to focus on this political risk. And so this is a pretty good illustration and summary of my presentation. Growth is definitely higher than it used to be at global level, but higher growth doesn't mean lower risk because it's a risk, it's an environment where we have both a quite high growth, but also a quite high level of risk. Thank you.